All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience as we worked out some technical issues. For those of you that are online in the webinar, I saw several familiar and also people I didn't know, but we'll be having this as a webinar style and you'll be able to submit questions in chat. We have a moderator in the Zoom that'll be able to field your questions at the end. So on behalf of the Department of Political Science, from also the Center on Indo-Pacific Affairs, the APEX Study Center here at UHM, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and the Department of Asian Studies. So we have a big crew of supporting departments and programs. I want to welcome you all to today's talk. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Vinod Aggarwal with us today. He really in many ways needs no introduction, but he is the Distinguished Professor and Alann P. Bedford Professor of Asian Studies at UC Berkeley and in the Department of Political Science there. He is also the affiliated professor at the Haas School of Business and director of the Berkeley Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Study Center. Do you pronounce it Basque or is it Basque? He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Business and Politics, chair of the U.S. Consortium of APEX Study Centers, and he serves as affiliated graduate faculty in the Department of Asian Studies here at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa as well. He's published over 21 books, 150 articles and book chapters, and has been dealing recently with the issue of economic statecraft. So I'm really sort of interested in this topic as well. So we're really looking forward to your research today. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, I appreciate the invitation and thanks to all the centers. I don't think I remember every single one, but I thank all of you for supporting this talk, and I'm looking forward to it. This is my first talk as an affiliate member of the Asian Studies faculty, so I'm very excited. COVID hasn't gone away, obviously, as everybody's wearing a mask, but I do hope at some point I can, we can have a more exciting exchange in person, and we're trying to do our best. So I'm going to talk about economic statecraft and what we call new economic statecraft. And in particular, I wanted to say that I've been working with Andrew Reddy, one of my former graduate students who's now a professor in the Information School and the Public Policy School, works at the Public Policy School, also at the University of California, Berkeley. And we have been developing a series of papers over the last few years. We have like 5 or 6 papers in various journals, World Trade Review, et cetera, where we look at this concept of economic statecraft. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Naturally, it doesn't work. Technology, let's see. I can't make the slides go back in there. I don't know why this clicker is not working. Okay, well. Okay, so I'm going to begin by talking about what is new economic statecraft, and I'll give you some historical context of what economic statecraft talks about. Then I'll talk about the recent development military crises that we've seen. We've had this crisis, of course, in the Ukraine invasion by the Russians, and then we have this, of course, tension over Taiwan, and that's been a very important issue, and we have the Chinese actions in that area. So we'll talk about this new economic statecraft that we matter. Then I'll talk about the framework that Andrew and I have developed and look at that as a way of thinking about intervention in markets. And then we'll talk about AI, artificial intelligence, in terms of one of the case studies. So what is a new economic statecraft? I'll talk about that in more detail, but let me begin by saying that neoliberal economics tends to believe that government should get out of the way of markets. Not all economists, of course, believe that, but they've, in the reality, states have long sought to influence their domestic markets by intervening in markets. So they, despite the claims that intervention should not be there, we see countries intervening all the time. And I might point out, it's not just China that's intervening or the Japanese that are intervening in their economy. It's also the American government has intervened in the economy in various ways. We've also seen a debate about security of supply in light of the US-China trade war, the global pandemic, and energy markets. We've seen that, of course, and when we think about security of supply, if somebody would have said that wearing a face mask is a matter of national security, everybody would have laughed at them. And if I would have said we should have global supply chains where we produce our own face masks for security, people would have laughed at me more. So what constitutes an industry that's important for national security is not obvious. And what we do see, however, is the return of strategic competition. And unlike some people who argue, well, we're going back to the Cold War, just as we had with the Soviet Union, I would say that's a very misleading analogy because, in fact, although we have a bipolar world that we might likely enter in terms of security realm, we probably will not because Russia is also an important nuclear power. And so we'll probably have more of a tripolar world at one level. And in terms of the interaction between China and the United States, it's fundamentally different than the interaction between the United States and the Soviet Union, because of course we did not trade almost at all with the Soviet Union. We did not have much investment with the Soviet Union. There were no corporate lobbies that were trying to encourage a good relationship with the Soviet Union so that they could invest there. So it's a very different context, even though the overall structure might be the same. So let me give you a little historical background on thinking about what statecraft is and how statecraft works. Well, if you look at Bill Clinton, when he was running for election in 1992, now 30 years ago, he said it's the economy, stupid, right? So don't worry about other things, focus on the economy. And of course, we know that the global economy is not just about trade deficits and low-cost supply chains and worrying about unemployment growth rates. There's also an important security element. That may seem obvious, but of course, I do teach in the business school, and there, when I tell my students about security, they look at me blankly and say, why is this important? Aren't you just interested in getting low-cost labor and finding the best supply chain, which unfortunately some of my colleagues also talk about, which is not entirely accurate. Now, if we think about economic statecraft or just statecraft more generally, it's not just economic statecraft. You can also have political statecraft, security statecraft. And the old approach, thinking about national security and politics, had little integration of economics. So if we think of someone, a prominent realist, Henry Kissinger, he was completely bored with economic issues. He did not think they were important. And he said, you know, just focus on high security, nuclear weapons, power balances, alliances, and the like. My good friend John Mearsheimer, who's at the University of Chicago, also is very much focused on security, hard security, not thinking about the economic aspects as much as well. So we do see this kind of historical basis of studying statecraft. Now, what we call new economic statecraft or economic statecraft is not a new idea. There's a very classic book by David Baldwin, who was at Columbia University, and David Baldwin focused on sanctions. And he looked at economic sanctions as states manipulate other countries for sanctions. We've had sanctions in Iraq against Iraq. We've had sanctions against different countries. We now have sanctions against Russia. So the notion of using sanctions is not a new idea. So that's all. There is a literature on economic sanctions. But what's the point? The point is that if we look at these historical perspective on sanctions, it's not just about the use of sanctions. So we see some people were not interested at all in economic aspects. I told you about that. Some people are only interested in sanctions. But in our view, this traditional way of looking at statecraft, be it political statecraft or economic statecraft, is kind of missing the boat if it only focuses on sanctions. So that brings us to what we call new economic statecraft. And basically, this is part of a bigger, broader project that Andrew and I are working on. We're doing a book together looking at several high-tech industries, AI, quantum computing, synbio, and cybersecurity, on which we've already published a special issue, looking at the conditions under which states intervene in their market, right? When do you intervene in your domestic market? When do you try to intervene in foreign markets? That could be promoting exports, promoting investment and the like. And it's not all kinds of investment or all kinds of intervention. We're really focused on high technology, dual use industries. So we're narrowing it down not to all kind of intervention in the world, excuse me, but dual use. So what the question, the puzzle is, why do countries intervene? And how do they intervene? And I'll explain that in a little while because it's not as obvious as one might think in terms of the kinds of intervention we see. So before we jump into looking at strategic intervention or security intervention, this is my favorite example of claiming national security. right? So this worries me a lot because this is from the 1959 Pastore hearings, which I was reading. They're actually compelling reading if you have nothing to do. Don't read, if you want to read it before you go to bed, that's a good thing, you'll sleep well. But there were like 800 pages of hearings. And basically industry representatives were testifying about the importance of their sector, right? And they said, here's the woolen industry, we need 150, 200 million woolen blankets to ensure survival in case of atomic war. Now, caveat emptor, don't try this at home. If there's a nuclear attack, the woolen blanket will only delay the time in which you get vaporized. So I don't think that the blankets will actually work. I don't want to contradict a well-known lobby like the woolen blanket lobby. Of course, this is not quite my favorite one. My most favorite example is the lace industry. And the cotton lace industry said, well, after tanks and steel, the second most important, and we accept wool is important because we're the third most important industry. And I no longer ask my students to guess because they say politically incorrect things as to why lace would be an important issue for national security. But given that we're in Hawaii, the answer is actually military reasons. And what is a military reason? The lace industry in these same hearings said, in case of war, there would be chaos in the US military if we were solely reliant on the Japanese. Don't forget it, the Japanese were former enemy of the United States, obviously in the 1950s, and they were the most important lace exporter. And why is that the case? They said, well, because epaulets are used to signify who is a colonel and who is a general and who's a sergeant. And if we did not have our own domestic lace industry to make epaulets, the US military will be in chaos. Okay, now, all this is to say that it is often hard to distinguish between intervention just because of domestic lobbying, which a lot of economists rightly worry about. So everybody claims their industry is important for national security. And maybe I shouldn't be doing this, but when I teach my MBA students, I say there are two ways to get protection: jobs, jobs, jobs. And the second one is national security, national security, and national security. And President Trump used to do that, both of those, right? National security and jobs. So this is and it's not just him, long-standing approach to that. So it becomes more complicated to think about that. Now let's do a little bit of theorizing about where does this come from. And this is actually an important foundational debate, right? So the foundational debate has to do with neoliberalism, which is kind of neo-economics, free trade, lower transaction costs, increase efficiency. And a second school of thought coming from realism and mercantilism, or neo-mercantilism, says you should be thinking about security of supply. That is, you can't rely on other countries so much. And the most famous book on this issue was actually by Albert Hirschman, well-known economist from Princeton. And Albert Hirschman wrote a great book called The Structure of Foreign Trade, where he looked at how Nazi Germany manipulated its trading relationships with Eastern European countries to make them dependent on Nazi Germany. Right, so that's an example. So this is not new. Again, this is a well-known thing. Oh, this is working now. I feel better. All right. So when we think about efficiency, what do economists like? Well, they like efficiency for obvious reasons. You don't want to waste resources. They look for the lowest cost in global production and economic gains. And what they do, however, is neglect political and strategic aspects. So in some sense, they get carried away by their focus on efficiency. And then to contrast that, we can think of security of supply, which neo-mercantilists are interested in, and they are very concerned about supply chains in the modern era, distribution networks. And if you look at the Trump administration, they issued many papers in which they looked at all of the different industries that the United States was going to somehow protect, bolster, and support because they were important for national security. Some of them were important for national security. I'm not sure they were all important for national security, but that is the problem of the lobbying process, right? And especially in an open democracy like the United States, it's not unknown for industries to secure protection. Even in Hawaii, we have some protection, as we know. All right, now they say, look, we need state intervention. We should be trying to influence other countries through security and economic gains. And there's this tussle between economic efficiency and security of supply. Now, the reality check is a continuum, right? So if we only have efficiency, we make ourselves vulnerable as a nation. And if we just say trade only takes place between corporations and consumers, et cetera, which is kind of a very naive economistic view of the world, then we have a problem. On the other hand, if we're obsessed only with security of supply and pursue massive protectionism, as some might advocate, and say, well, Americans should just make everything at home, we should have our own steel, we should have our own textiles, we should have our own aircraft, all of these things, and every industry is potentially important, then we'll have a great deal of inefficiency because this undermines the whole principle of free trade and efficiency and comparative advantage, which holds in many cases, not in every single case. So now let's turn to what we're interested in and why this is a big deal. So number one, the idea of technology dual use, which is industries that could be important for either security or for commercial reasons, is not new. We had the biology industry, we had the nuclear industry, civilian nuclear technology, we had the chemical industry. So it's not old, it's not new news that we were concerned with these issues in the 1950s and 60s and worried about dual use. And in fact, the United States imposed export controls under COCOM to restrict the exports of certain strategic materials to the Soviet Union and its allies. Right, so we've had export controls for a very, very long time. The Bureau of International Security, BIS, in the Commerce Department is in charge of that. And you'll hear more about the BIS these days because, of course, they're now in charge of all of the export controls we are using against the Chinese, right? Because we're now very concerned about Chinese access to technology. So what's new since it's been, well, what's new is we have these really rapid technological developments in quantum computing, in AI, in cybersecurity, in synthetic biology. All of these things are very new. And what we see is in the United States and in many other countries, including China, a lot of these are often developed with a civilian application in mind. And if you think about some of these issues, the cutting edge technology is not in the CIA and the NSA, National Security Agency. It's in Silicon Valley, 20 miles from me in the south and San Francisco. And we're not talking about Facebook, but we're talking about serious, important, high critical industries. And those are developed by the commercial sector. And the US government's in a quandary because we want the commercial sector to be innovative and create these industries. On the other hand, we don't want them to willy-nilly be selling these everywhere and for other countries to have access to our new technology. So we have a problem, right? What are some examples where we have intervention in the past? Dual use. Well, GPS, that was developed for military reasons. The internet, right, obviously developed for military reasons as well, so that we would have a multiple node approach, that if one node was attacked by the Soviet Union, you would have other nodes available to route your communications through those nodes. We have supercomputing, where the government's been highly involved. And of course, the government's been highly involved in infrastructure. I don't know if all of you know this, but the interstate highway system, including the sort of interstate highway system H3, H1, and H2, one has to wonder about interstate, but those highway systems are paid for by the federal government. Those were developed by Eisenhower in the 1950s, and they actually developed the interstate system primarily so you could move ICBMs around easily on the highways. Right, so that was where that came from. So the notion that somehow the Americans don't intervene in the economy is simply wrong. We've consistently intervened. The Chinese, now we've intervened in different ways, et cetera. So now there are very few civilian-only applications. Why do I say that? Well, I bought a drone. I wasn't very good at flying it, but who would have thought that the Ukrainians are using drones to attack the Russians, or the Russians are using drones to attack the Ukrainians, right? So it's a little drone and you just put a little bomb on it or whatever. So that's really quite striking on some things that might be in gaming technology. I mean, if you're a really good gaming, you'll be recruited to fly drones, right? If you're really good at, so we do see these dual use technologies. So it's a difference in kind in some respects with all these new industries. And the thing is that primarily these are very civilian technologies developing in the civilian sector, which makes it important. So what are these examples where the government's taken an interest? Well, I don't know if you've heard of DIU, but DIU is the Defense Department to invest in Silicon Valley. So if you want money for your company, you go to DIU, Defense Investment Unit, and you can get money from them. And even more famous, much more famous, and somewhat competitive with DIU is In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is the CIA's venture capital arm. If you go look at their website, they don't say, you know, we are some company. They say we're the CIA venture capital arm. If you want money, take money from us, and we were very interested in your technology. Now, if you talk to people at In-Q-Tel and DIU, they have a problem. And the problem is that in many cases, there's already been investments made by startups have already gone after money. They get money. Startups, when you're running a startup, you try to get money from wherever you can. And they've gotten money from the Chinese. And this is a problem, right? So if you've taken VC money, venture capital money, and suddenly In-Q-Tel calls you up and says, hi, you want to take venture capital money from us? And they say, sure. But then, of course, the CI is not stupid. In-Q-Tel is not stupid. They're going to say, excuse me, you all have these investments from the Chinese. You can't be sharing your technology with venture capital firms from the Chinese and be working for us. We want exclusivity because some of these things are military applications. Right. So it's like, okay, there's money available, but it's hard to get that money if you've already taken money. So that became a very important issue, which I'll talk about just in a few minutes. Some examples of dual use technology are promotion of human capital development. Why is that particularly interesting? Well, if you look at starting salaries in Silicon Valley and you have an undergraduate degree in computer science from Berkeley or Stanford, I don't know about other universities, your starting salary is about $180,000. Okay. As an academic, I'm always stunned by these salaries, but 180,000, 200,000, undergraduate, fresh undergraduate, no experience. How is the CIA, NSA going to compete with Silicon Valley salaries and stock options? So we've written about this. We've given some advice to the government. You guys have got to develop a plan where you recruit young people working in Silicon Valley firms who either feel some loyalty to the US government, want to go work in the government for a low salary, or want to work with the cool GWiz. NSA does have some GWiz cool stuff. And you know, then when you work in the CIA, you can say things like, what do you do? And then you can say, I would like to tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. And so that's a nice line on a date. So, you know, that maybe that's a good reason. But of course, you know, those are some reasons to do it. So basically, we have a human capital problem, not because we don't have enough computer science students, but because how are we going to get them to go work in Washington? So that's why DIU and In-Q-Tel and other agencies are actually all hanging. Homeland is also interested in hanging around Silicon Valley and other places. We've also been using export controls. You know that well with respect to China, and we've used export controls in a number of areas. And the other thing is that we've been using is this controls on foreign direct investment. And again, this is not new. So this thing called CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, is an interagency committee that can review all foreign investment. And if I remember correctly, I think they go back to 1979. And something, if I don't remember the numbers exactly, but something like 5 cases where they blocked an investment, including the most famous one, which is a case that I teach in the business school, which is the so-called Dubai Ports case. And in the case of Dubai Ports wanted to acquire a port in the United States. And when they decided to do that, post 9/11, 2001, this small company in Florida called up some reporter and said, hey, do you know we're going to let Arab terrorists run our ports? Literally, okay? Even though Dubai was our ally, even though Bush said it, they're our ally, even though the Coast Guard said there's no danger with Dubai ports because we've already vetted them. And so the US government was all for Dubai ports making this acquisition, or they were not opposed. But the small Florida company, using political leverage with the press and so on, made this into an anti-Arab, anti-what have you, terrorists are going to come and occupy, and the CFIUS ruled against this acquisition. Now, what happened next? Well, that was back in 2001. Nothing much happened. So there were very few cases if you look at the history of CFIUS. Suddenly, the Trump administration on a very strong bipartisan basis. There are almost no votes against this. So Democrats and Republicans actually agreed on this. The horrible name, Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. God knows who came up with this title. I just call it FIRMA. And when people ask me what's FIRMA, I never remember what it stands for. But FIRMA is really, really important. If you want a guaranteed job, become a FIRMA lawyer. I can tell you this is, you'll be set for life, or at least for the next 40 years. Now, what is so exciting about FIRMA? FIRMA is an expedited review process, and also it reviews, it's what we would call enhanced CFIUS, which means over the next 5 years, all these investment deals will come under great scrutiny. And FIRMA also is looking at private equity firms and their ownership and who's investing in private equity firms. It's also looking at venture capital firms. So it extends the reach of the US government into looking at all of these investments coming into the United States. Okay? Now, is the United States the only one doing this? No, in the special issue of Global Asia that Andrew and I did on technology, we looked at investment regulations. The Europeans are doing it at the EU level. The Germans are doing this kind of stuff. The British are doing this kind of, the French are doing this kind of stuff. Each country, the Chinese and the Japanese, everyone's obsessed with reviewing investment. The Germans have blocked many investments coming into China recently because they were concerned about national security and turning over some of their key industries, which they think are important for national security, and letting the Chinese invest in them. So this is not an American thing only. This is a big business. And the Chinese said, oh, look, the Americans have FIRMA. We'll just copy FIRMA. Literally, they just copied the legislation and said, we, the Chinese, also have FIRMA. And so they don't call it FIRMA, but it's a similar notion, right? So the idea of regulating foreign direct investment is very important because prior to this time, if you were a corporate lawyer involved in M&A, mergers and acquisition, you would generally look at only the antitrust implications of the investment, right? Okay, is this company going to have a very large position in the US market? It's uncompetitive behaviors. What should we do? Now you will come under FIRMA scrutiny, right? And there are all these fast tracks. You can pre-approve your deal with FIRMA. And if you just type in FIRMA, you will see about 50 law firms have a memo on this because they're trying to get clients, because this is a big deal in terms of reviewing foreign investment. So that's with respect to dual use technologies, we see a lot of that. Okay, now moving on to this question of new economic statecraft. So just as Andrew Wood, all of us wrote these papers, both of us wrote these papers, suddenly this year has been tough for us. Now, why is it tough for us? Because we talk about this stuff and people say, oh, new economic statecraft, trade, intervention, who cares about this stuff? We should be concerned with high politics, tanks, weapons, all this kind of stuff. Look at Taiwan, live fire exercises after the visit of Pelosi to Taiwan. Suddenly, it's a changed world, right? Are we back to the World War II kind of mentality? Not World War II, but national security. Are we now going back to see a separation of economics and security, or will new economic statecraft still be important? So that was one of the issues, is new economic statecraft already passé? So we've called this new economic statecraft, trying to influence trade, investment, and industrial policy. And after these crises, is that it? Right? Like, that was nice. We wrote a couple of papers, but we say no. We think that this concept will continuously be important. We're not the only one who are thinking about these issues, where lots of people are thinking about new economic statecraft in some ways, investment. And we will be looking at, we'll see that global supply chains continue to be a hot issue in American politics today. Everyone's talking about global supply chains. No one paid any attention to global supply chains before. Now we're concerned about global supply chains and security. Continued trade conflict with China. Many people mistakenly thought that as soon as Biden comes into office, he would reverse all of the Trump tariffs against the Chinese. And I actually did, in writing, say that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because the Democrats are much more protectionist than the Republicans. So why would you think that a coalition built on labor in the United States is going to suddenly say, let's have free trade? Traditionally, Democrats have been protectionist and Republicans have been liberal. Now that we have this extreme Republican right, they and the progressive Democratic left on trade look identical. right? There's very little difference between the trade policy that the progressive Democrats want and the right-wing Republicans want. So that's a strange coalition if you want it, right? But that's what's happening. And we will see greater efforts, as I've suggested, to regulate cross-border investment, right? So now investment will continue to be regulated. So we don't think that just because there's these hot wars going on between Ukraine and the Russians, or even with the Taiwan crisis, that economic statecraft is safe. Now, why does that seem likely? Well, think about the Taiwan case. Well, why are the Americans obsessed with Taiwan these days? Well, one reason they're obsessed with Taiwan is because TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, is in Taiwan. And we want to make sure that those high-end chips, which Intel and other American companies do not make, in fact, the best chips are TSMC in the world, semiconductor chips, and Samsung also makes extremely high-quality chips just after TSMC. So we are not the leading edge of chip making in the United States anymore. It's the Taiwanese. Now that creates a weird dynamic because we are saying to TSMC, why don't you invest in the United States? Samsung, why don't you invest in the United States? And if you were the Taiwanese, you would say, yes, that's a good idea. But if TSMC essentially picks up and moves to the United States, will the US, and to be blunt, will the US care about Taiwan? Maybe not, right? Maybe, well, it's sort of part of China. Why not, Yeah. And so it's going to be a problem. So you have to think about this. Now, TSMC is not putting in the latest technology in their investments in the United States. They're very concerned about that. They're not just, giving us or showing their latest technology. So that will be a continued issue. So moving on to the more theoretical part of the presentation, how do we categorize this? And you can have access to these slides. But basically, I won't go through each of these elements. So typically, most people and most economists actually think about at the border measures, right? Trade policy, tariffs, exports. That's what people think about with trade, investment policy, for most of things. But of course, a lot of the exciting action, as Simon Ebnet and I have written about, and other people have, he's written about it with other people as well, are behind the border. So what do we mean by behind the border investment, intervention? We think about quotas, health standards, safety standards, regulations. I'll just tell you a very quick example of that. The Canadians, Ontario, specifically province of Ontario, banned beer being sold in bottles. They said, beer can only ban cans. Beer can only be sold in bottles for environmental reasons. And upon first reading, that says, yeah, that makes sense. You can clean up the bottles again. No, but what was their motivation? Anybody want to guess? Well, the answer is keep out American beer because it's hard to ship bottles and they have a breakage cost. So what are we saying? We see that it's very easy for industries to glom on to the favorite reason to protect: environmental reasons, medical and safety, health standards. People glom onto these reasons. If you're an industry and you think, how will I get protection? Religious reasons, religious freedom reasons. So industries are very good at looking for reasons to block investment, imports, and so on, industrial policy, etc. And then, of course, there's beyond the border, government promotion of trade or foreign investment. The United States has done it. But of course, the Japanese were the experts. They had JETRO, export trading, where the Japanese used to help their firms go to other countries. The Chinese have lots of promotion of their exports through their various agencies, Chinese agencies, through various aid agencies and the like, investment in terms of banking support. And so there's lots of action going on at all of these three levels: behind the border, at the border, and beyond the border. But not every country is pursuing the same kinds of policies, right? So there's a lot of variation in what they use. So if you want to use some turgid social science, these are the dependent variables. The dependent variables is what we're trying to explain. Why do we get these kinds of interventions? And which ones do we get? And we're trying to explain that through these kinds of a 5-factor model. And these 5 factors it's a framework. So this is not a precise, specific one variable model. Basically, you look at the market characteristics of the industry. So we can think of what are the market characteristics of the AI industry or the semiconductor industry, which is highly concentrated, the auto sector, Aircraft industry is highly concentrated. You can use some kind of Porter's five forces to look at barriers to entry, standard kind of market analysis that you do in the business school. So what are the market characteristics of the industry? So how does AI look compared to, say, synbio, synthetic biology? Then you can look at things that a lot of political scientists like to look at, which is the domestic structure of individual countries, the hierarchy in terms of the political structure, what is the role of the state in the economy, which looks different in Singapore than it does in the United States. And this attacks kind of the naive notion of some economists who say, oh, well, all countries are basically either capitalist or communist. No, there's a whole varieties of capitalism literature, which shows that German capitalism is also capitalism, and Japanese capitalism looks very different than American capitalism, which looks different than, if we want to call it, Chinese capitalism. So the structure of the government and its relationship to firms is the next variable. That's important. The technological characteristics of the industry. Are there externalities? Are they civilian in nature, like gaming? Is synthetic bio, which has dual use, very important dual use aspects to it, the technological characteristics. And finally, the system level characteristics. Are we in a bipolar world, multipolar world? That will affect whether or not states are willing to intervene. If it's a benign world, and there's not much conflict at the systemic level, then you would not see as much security of supply intervention. If you get into a much more bipolar Cold War, then you will see, of course, the two powers tussling with each other, trying to protect their industries against each other. So that's the systemic characteristic. And finally, there are, of course, these global international regimes that try to guide things like the World Trade Organization, but there are also efforts like the Information Technology Agreement, which tries to manage trade in information technology products. We also have the Basic Telecom Agreement, which manages activity in telecom. So countries are not just sitting around. And when countries intervene, there's an effort at the international level to regulate some of these things, right? To make sure that countries are not unfairly intervening. So that is the bucket with the five-factor model. And this is the state intervention we're trying to explain. Now, obviously, this is like five big buckets chasing just a few dependent variables, and you have a statistical problem, right? That, there are too many variable model. So you need to kind of control things, right? You have to say, well, let's hold constant the system level characteristics and the regimes or the technological, and then look at what is the importance of market or domestic characteristics, right? So there are ways to get around the factor that this model is a broad framework for different industries, but in some cases you can only look at one industry. So you can hold the technological characteristics of an industry constant, which allows you to say something about the role of other factors. These of all five factors are bouncing around. Who knows what's causing the intervention, right? So you need to control things as we do in social science. So let me wrap up by talking about AI as an example. The AI industry, we see this kind of picture where you see a lot of AI kind of activities. And many people are saying we're in an arms race with the Chinese, and the Chinese are going to win. Now, why might the Chinese win the AI arms race, if you want it? Well, most people say because the Chinese are much more willing to engage in grabbing people's data, right? So basically, they're not concerned so much as we are of consumer rights in the United States. Not that our consumer rights are always protected or that data is always not protected, but probably more than in China. Europeans are much more concerned than the Americans are in terms of data privacy. In fact, the Europeans are the leaders in data privacy, not the United States. And in fact, California is adopting European data directives, right? So there's an important aspect of who's driving regulation of data protection. So if you have unlimited access to the healthcare system, as the Chinese do, of who has what disease and what treatments work, and who is driving where and who's crossing the street, and facial recognition, it would not be surprising that the Chinese would do very well in this thing, in this data business, AI until now. Now, this is very hotly contested. When I say this, people go crazy if they work in AI and they go, oh, no, Americans are far ahead. Well, this is a kind of a naive American view. We're ahead in everything. Not really, actually. We're not ahead in solar panels. We're not ahead in wind turbines. We're not ahead in a number of industries. So this notion that we're ahead because we see Boeing, and Boeing is behind Airbus, ironically. So this is not as simple as you might think. So let's look at AI. And number of research publications, the United States is still leading. China is not far behind at all, is now number 2 in terms of research publications, right? So AI research publications. This is what we need, some indicators. Obviously, this is one of the indicators we can look at. So what is AI? I think everybody knows what AI is. Let me start at the bottom. My favorite AI that all the academics are now freaked out about. If I read my email, I get like 50 emails a day from this TeachNet forum we have at Berkeley, all freaked out about ChatGPT. Okay, if you haven't used ChatGPT, you are living in the dark ages, because this has been available since November, and all of your students have already been writing papers. Students are very quick, and they're already writing papers using ChatGPT. So that's AI. Right, that is AI. That's a very important AI application. And then, of course, then in the same teaching forum that we have, somebody wrote back, oh, but there's an AI detector. So it'll detect if you're using AI using ChatGPT. So I said, great. So now we have the weapon and we also have the defense. So I immediately said, how does this defense work? So this is also freely available. You can email me if you want, but if you can find it. Basically, you enter text into your student essay into this ChatGPT detector, and on one hand, on one it says, "What are you, a robot, or are you a human?" And it's really cool. There's a little. The more you type, the little thing goes back and forth, and then finally, oh, you're human. Oh no, you're a robot. So I thought, is Vinny a robot or a human? So I said, how do I fool the ChatGPT detector? So I wrote an essay. And I started by saying, this essay argues, blah, blah, blah. Every time I made a mistake, a spelling mistake, I became human. So I said, oh, it's really clear. So I separately wrote my essay, checked it for spelling, checked it for grammar, made it sound really good, stuck it into ChatGPT, and I was a robot. 99% chance I was a robot. So then I sent my essay around to everybody and said, guess what? I'm a robot. So Vinny is a robot now because of so what am I saying? It's not so basically, if your students are smart and write well, they will be accused of plagiarism. And the Australians announced 2 days ago that they are no longer giving any take-home exams. Everything will be blue books with a pen. So that, I don't do much grading. My graduate students do, poor suffering people, are going to be reading student handwriting again. Forget typing. Sorry? I know, so it's fine. People will be able to read it because they can only print very slowly. So this is an example of, if you want to call it a decision support system, that's an example. And then I thought, oh, I have to write this paper for my own conference. And I said, hello, ChatGPT. Write a 5,000 word essay on economic statecraft and the benefits and the problems, and use references. It coughed up a 5,000 word essay, which was excellent. It only failed because it did not cite me. But otherwise, as all academics know, that's the only thing we really care about. But it was a great essay. And if I would have read that essay, I would have said, easy A. Really well done, cites some of the literature, not all of it, but really well written essay, goes through all the pros and the cons. So this is really changing our own lives. Now, of course, things like that, computer vision, large-scale language model, deep learning, pattern recognition, all of that is all tied together, has an important military implications, right? National security, tracking people, tracking terrorists, all of this is very important. So these are very important enabling technologies. So what do we see? Yeah. Oh, here's another. This is the same thing. Here's a global distribution of AI startups in this data. We see the US is far ahead in terms of AI-focused startups, artificial intelligence startups. Chinese are there. Europeans are ahead. But of course, the Chinese are catching up with respect to AI startups as well. Now, let's just look at 3 examples and then I'll wrap up. So what has the United States done? It's come up with a number of government-driven initiatives. So this whole idea of free market is misleading. The US has a NIST AI risk management framework. Artificial Intelligence Office has been established all under Biden. National Security Commission under Trump. AI initiative. And recently, you may know about the Chips and Science Act, which was just passed a couple of months ago, which will pouring money in $1.8 billion into the semiconductor industry, which course, has an effect on AI. So the US is in the game of government support of the AI industry. And I just want to say, looking at an area we worked on a lot, cybersecurity. So we looked at this, we talked to some firms, and a lot of firms have the view, which is in that great song, "Don't stand so close to me," right? Hey, I don't want your government intervention. Stay away. We're on our own. Stop trying to regulate us. And so in the US, we have this tradition where American firms don't want government intervention. Now, if you throw enough money at them in certain industries, they love it. If you're protecting them because they're not doing well, see Steele and Trump, then they love it. But in general, American industry is very wary of government intervention because they think what comes next? Regulation. And as soon as you have regulation, they can't do what they want. Now, China has a lot of initiatives through this military civilian fusion. Here are just some examples of things they've done, including digital Silk Road, industrial parks. So they are serious about AI. If we look at AI talent in terms of number of researchers, and we look at top AI talent, we can see the US is still ahead, but the Chinese are again #2 and coming up very rapidly in AI. So, while we are dithering about sort of lots of other things, political correctness, the Chinese are moving and are taking over industry after industry, particularly in AI. So I worry about that a lot in American universities. Third, if we look at Germany, that is middle powers. There are lots of middle powers. Our conference in 2 weeks is on like Korea and what it was Korea doing in Singapore and maybe India, Japan as well. Kristi's writing about Japan. These are middle powers pursuing economic statecraft, right? So, and their problem is they're caught between the United States and China. And as all of you know, probably, when it comes to trade, Asian middle powers all trade more with China than they do the United States. And yet they still are relying on us for their security. This creates a important nexus or disjuncture where they want to have access to the Chinese market, but they want Uncle Sam to protect them. It's hard to maintain that duality if you want. So Germany also has AI efforts. They're trying to do sorts of things, work councils and so on, and trying to develop AI. Now, how do you explain this variation, right? Why is the US doing certain things? So we kind of look at each of these, we looked at the important things, and we see that bureaucratic politics is at work. The relationship between firms and governments are important. As I already mentioned, firms often lobby for non-intervention. They don't want to be regulated. Sometimes regulators are paying a lot of attention, so we get different outcome and action plans. So we look at, as in our model, we look at the number of competitors, security of supply. This is kind of standard business school. How do you look at a market? Human talent, economies of scale. This project is not fully developed. It gives you a rough idea of what we're trying to do. We look at market characteristics, and then we looked at domestic structure already. And this is kind of our first cut, holding the other 3 variable types constant. We only look at domestic structure and market characteristics. And what do we see? We see significant differences, very German, centralized, which the Germans have always been very centralized firms. We see disaggregated bureaucratic responses. America, the United States does this, and we see China, a strong centralized it, but China, in terms of market, they lack access to quality. They have access to quality data, but not so good in terms of human capital. They have significant universities in Germany are very good in the high technology industry. And of course, we have all these AI startups in the United States, and we have all these universities. Now that, of course, is creating a big problem at Berkeley. I was on the committee on research at Berkeley. And one of the issues was, what do we do about Chinese students? Bluntly speaking, people say foreign, but we all know what they're saying. What do we do about Chinese students working in labs? And my colleagues who work in the sciences immediately said, how can the university be telling us what to do? Who is telling the FBI to come onto campus? We should be able to do what I want. And when I said, well, there might be some national security concerns. He's a problem. Vinny's a problem. He's trying to block the free exchange of information. Okay? And the FBI is very interested in what professors are doing. Right? They're very concerned about what kinds of research professors are doing. Fortunately, they don't care about political scientists very much because we're not doing the research that will critically affect anybody. No, I'm just kidding, I hope. But they're really concerned about synthetic biology. They're really concerned about quantum computing. They're really concerned about cybersecurity, and they're watching those people in their labs. What are they doing, and what is the relationship with the Chinese? Which is of course, it's not a great thing. If you're a Chinese graduate student working at Berkeley, you would like to be treated like everybody else, as opposed to an agent of the Chinese government. But of course, universities are very concerned because of the FBI being very concerned. And the FBI now visits faculty members all the time on campuses to talk to them about what are they doing, who they have in their lab. So anyways, we see this disaggregated response in the United States, AI startups. And as I said, where the US is very concerned on foreign direct investment and is playing a very aggressive role. And they're worried that the Chinese will work around, there's some articles about that, and find ways to invest in American AI and other issues that we're interested in indirectly through proxies, and therefore will gain access to high technology in the United States. So that's kind of the issue. So this is just a kind of a thumbnail sketch of how these things might affect industries. So let me wrap up given the time. So there's been a lot of research on the consequences of emerging technologies on international security, but not that much has been spent on what causes emerging technologies to arise. Obviously the market, obviously research, but less obviously government intervention, right? So the idea is bringing government, not that we're saying we should have government intervention all the time. I'm not advocating government intervention in all industries. In fact, they may do better without government intervention, but the reality is that countries are systematically intervening in critical industries, critical emerging technologies. And it's not going to go away. And in the future, we're going to see that. So what are some issues? Well, what's a dual use technology? As I was saying earlier, if I said, oh, face masks are a dual use technology and we should be totally self-sufficient, everybody would have laughed 4 years ago. So who knows what dual use is? If you know, tell us, tell me. Second, what are the patterns of technology trade in emerging technology? What do we see? Is the US able to convince its allies, which they're trying to do in the semiconductor business, to not sell to the Chinese, right? Or to ban Huawei, as the United States did aggressively, from selling in these countries. And my favorite story is I was talking to a French general, who shall remain nameless, and I said to him, well, you know, how do the French think about this? I mean, we know what the Americans are thinking about, we know what the Chinese are thinking. How do you think about it? And he says, in a very French way, he says, well, right now, we're happy to have the Americans provide us with equipment and they're spying on us. But later on, we may just be as happy, maybe we'll let the Chinese spy on us. But we know that everybody's spying on us, right? Because we have no indigenous technology of their own. So he was basically saying, yes, we know you're spying on me, but you're better than the Chinese so far, right? That's the Chinese view, the French view. Okay, and then of course, we need to look at regional context, you know, what's going on in terms of middle power strategies in East Asia, Europe, where we see a lot of concern. The Italians are suddenly obsessed with economic statecraft and how should they position themselves. The Hungarians are interested in that. And then we've already written about this to some extent. What are the global implications of economic statecraft? In other words, what are the implications for the World Trade Organization, which was set up to promote free and open trade and has some investment aspects as well? What happens to the WTO if everybody starts pursuing economic statecraft? Right? If everybody is intervening in the economy and protecting their favorite industry, what happens to the WTO? And if the WTO is undermined, as it's on its path to being undermined already, both by Trump and by Biden, then we will have a free-for-all in global economics, right? There will be no institutions to regulate trade, no institutions to regulate finance, and it'll all be done on at a national basis. And that will lead to what? Trade and investment wars. We've been there before. It was called the 1930s. It's not a world that we necessarily want to live in. And we know there was some aftermath of the 1930s. I'm not giving you a direct correlation or causality between the 1930s and World War II. But of course, there are some concerns about this aggressive intervention in the economy. So people say, what's wrong if we intervene in the economy? Well, nothing, but if everybody plays the same game, there is a problem. There's a systemic outcome which is detrimental to everyone. And this is a classic problem, like arms racing problems in political science. If everybody builds up their security, then everybody's in trouble, right? In some sense, you're just spending a lot of money, but nobody is more secure. So we might see this kind of out. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. And I look forward to your questions and also to any online questions, if there are any. And I don't know who's managing that, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. All right. So thank you for a really engaging and fascinating talk. We're technically supposed to stop at 4, but because we started late, I'm going to suggest that we go at least until 4:15. And then we can also continue the conversation informally upstairs at a reception that's being hosted by the Asian Studies department. And if you're gonna ask a question, I was encouraged to invite you to come up and speak into the speaker so that the people online can also hear you. And so at this point, I'm happy to entertain any questions in the room and then also invite any questions by chat. Yeah, Terry.
I think so, because both of you sit down on the chairs because the camera's been.
Oh, sure. Or if we stand back here, but yeah.
No, if you sit, and then we can adjust camera a bit. It's good.
Okay. So are there any questions in the room initially?
Go ahead.
Okay, can I just say, I'm really interested because of course, as soon as you say statecraft, and I'm thinking of diplomacy, and so I'm wondering, how does this play out in terms of the, diplomatic priorities, right? It sounds like there's a lot of competition, but what's happening on the other side of that? How is this impacting sort of, what is going on in the diplomatic realm? Do you see,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important issue. So I think these issues are increasingly coming into the diplomatic realm. And in the old days, you might just be talking about security issues, but bluntly put, the economic counselors in the American embassy around the world and in other countries, economic counselors are playing a greater role. And I think business is playing a greater role because business is very concerned about access to markets. So for many, many years, American business and European business were gung-ho on China. We've seen a dramatic reversal in the last 5 years. They've been very critical because a lot of them have lost their technology. The market did not turn out as well as they thought it would do. And they were kind of promised market access in China in exchange for sharing their technology. So those people are chambers of commerce are very actively lobbying diplomats to do something about the fact that their industry is being harmed. So this is increasingly entering the diplomatic realm, which was previously high politics. Let's talk about Ukraine, as you might talk about now. But now those economic counselors and their technology advisors, I would say, who are being pushed by the companies, are going to play a very active role. So diplomacy will not just be about high politics, but this kind of lower politics, industry, technology policy in the realm.
Another question?
I have a question. I'm not an economist, but the whole issue about Russia and trade sanctions has come up a lot in the news. And what I'm wondering is, because they're saying, well, sanctions could work, but then they're not working because there's such a need for oil. Is that part of the old economic statecraft then to use sanctions? And do we have to get beyond it?
Well, I think that was the traditional approach to think about economic statecraft in the economic realm, in economic statecraft, was sanctions. And we're using those sanctions against the Russians, clearly we're using those. Now, are they effective? I mean, that has a lot to do whether the Indians keep buying oil or the Chinese keep buying oil, which substitutes for Americans. In the technology realm, it's not very critical because some of the stuff is not directly affecting the Russians. I think it's much more relevant to think about China and then maybe Japanese relations with Korea. Those are areas in which those issues are very important. Now, there are indirect sanctions if you want, right? So for example, after we installed THAAD missiles, terminal high altitude defense missiles in Korea, the Chinese went after South Korea. And they went after Lotte department store, and they started discouraging tourists from coming to South Korea, particularly Jeju Island, right? So that is the kind of sanctioning behavior, if you want. So we're not saying that sanctioning behavior has gone away, but we think that it's expanded to all of these, what were previously kind of commercial realms of trade and investment and so on. So we do think sanctions as a policy will continue. We're just trying to expand the number of things that we look at in terms of how countries are operating with each other in terms of the industries that they're focusing on and what measures they're using in those industries.
So sanctions can still be effective.
Yes, well, no, that's a different issue.
I guess that's what I
That-
asked.
that's-
Maybe we should run sanctions on.
I mean,
for a
the
decade.
questions is, are sanctions effective? There is a huge literature on this.
But that's why I'm asking, is that the old economic statecraft? And is that why you need a new economic statecraft? Because things like sanctions are not having the intended effect.
No, I don't think that's the only reason to look at it. I mean, I don't think sanctions have always worked, but that doesn't mean that we won't continue to see sanction efforts, but they might be expanded, right? So a regulation on an incoming direct foreign investment is not exactly a sanction. It depends how you define economic sanctions. If you define economic sanctions as any kind of intervention, then there's no new economic statecraft. It's always been around. But we did not, for example, nobody would have thought we would be looking at TikTok and reviewing TikTok's investments in the United States. That's not a sanction. So those things are now becoming more prominent in business government relations. Whether sanctions work or not, there's such a massive literature on that, and it depends a lot on what is the kind of sanction you're using and what kind of technology. Sanctions were used, by the way, by the British against the French, and they prevented artisans from leaving Britain to go to France because they were worried about the export of skilled technology. It didn't work that well.
I am intrigued about the story that you talked to the French general trying to spy the US and the Chinese as opposed to doing something by themselves. Actually, thinking again, I don't think that is the best strategy. The cost of developing and creating AI technologies is extremely expensive and high. But the cost of producing, copying it is extremely cheap. So to some extent, being a follower might not be a bad strategy at all.
Yeah.
So the issue here is then for the US and for China, what strategy they should be doing. Should they continue to be the leader or should they continue to be the follower?
Yeah.
Things catching up is relatively easy to some extent.
So I would partly agree with you. So I would agree that basic AI code or basic AI methods or algorithms can be copied. I don't think you can easily copy human capital technological training. So it's not that, you know, I don't want to pick on any country by name, but I will. El Salvador can absorb AI technology that easily if they don't have the skills to do it. Indians can probably do it because they're pretty advanced in technology and have a lot of technological universities. But even the Germans might have a problem because the Germans have not invested very much in technology. They're kind of manufacturing technology. They're not in the R&D. So that's why, precisely what you say, a lot of these countries are very interested in human capital development, right? And it's because they say, well, if we have enough human capital development and we send them to America and to China and they learn there, they can come back and we can copy the Chinese and American technology. So that is a clever follower strategy that could work, but not without the human capital. And you know more than I that absorbing technology, it's one thing to say, here's some technology and what do I do with it, right? That's not trivial problem. So I think that's why there's been a big focus on universities and technological training in all of these countries. Because what are you going to do with the technology if you don't have a way of absorbing it?
Okay, looks like there's a couple of questions on the chat. Are you going to read them out? Go ahead.
The first question is, what is your take on the CHIPS Act and the latest round of US semiconductor export controls, diplomatic relation with other semiconductors, component producers? Which tech area you think US government will target next after semiconductors?
Okay, that's a good question. So the question is, the CHIPS Act, which I talked about, which was passed in December 22, what do I think of it? So at one level, I'm encouraged that the Biden administration is going away from just focusing on protecting industries that are old industries and thinking about semiconductors and so on. The American efforts to promote the semiconductor industry have had mixed results. Okay, we had these Semiconductor Industry Association, we had a semiconductor Semitech, in the 1980s, if I remember correctly. Semitech was an association of semiconductors where we tried to promote semiconductors. So it's not a trivial matter to pursue industrial policy. And a lot of the industrial policy goes badly, it doesn't always go well. And unfortunately, I have to say this, I don't think the US is well suited to pursuing activist industrial policy in a systematic way. I think the Chinese are much better at it, and even they've had problems. I think the Koreans are much better at it. And the United States is a great believer in laissez-faire, technology policy should be developed in universities and let the startups rule as they do in Silicon Valley and everything will be fine. But a lot of the research shows very systematically that the fact that Berkeley and Stanford were in the region was very important, and a lot of federal money funding went into a lot of Berkeley and Stanford, and the AI and the IT industry that was developed in Silicon Valley did not just spring whole without any government support. So I think there is a way of government support. And this gets into the deeper problem of what kind of industrial policy you want to pursue. And economists typically divide this into like macro policy, which everybody pursues, monetary policy, trade policy, but there's also horizontal industrial policy versus vertical industrial policy. So horizontal industrial policy says, okay, let's have more education. Let's give everybody accelerated depreciation on equipment. That doesn't say I'm picking this industry or that industry, although it could have an indirect effect. But vertical industry policy, let's pick chips, let's pick AI. And that's why we're particularly interested in looking at how is the US going to try to promote specific industries with vertical industry policy, right? And I don't think we've been set up for that. I think there's an ideological concern about government intervention. I think firms are wary, as I've mentioned, about government intervention. And so when the CHIPS Act was passed, I think the semiconductor people were excited, but then, what regulation is going to come? Is there going to be oversight? I think that's not clear yet. That's on the domestic side. At the international side, we've annoyed a lot of our allies by trying to say to them, you should be engaging with us in trying to restrict and using sanctions, using whatever export controls against China. And a lot of these companies like Samsung sell a lot of chips in China, right? And even TSMC sells chips in China. So they don't want to be told by their governments, and particularly they don't want to be told by the US government how they should pursue their commercial interests. And this is a classic problem, which is why I'm interested in business government relations, of how this balance is going to be worked out. It's not clear to me. And I think we're going to see this evolving over time. And I think if we use a very blunt tool by going after and sanctioning TSMC and Samsung, say, oh, yeah, you've been bad, as the US is prone to do, we might annoy more of these companies and then we'll keep selling what they want to whom they do, than if we try to use more carrot than stick. And I think typically the United States is very interested in some cases in using sticks against companies that we're unhappy with. Think about the Huawei examples where we aggressively went after them. But it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do if we can't buy Huawei equipment? Huawei equipment is very cheap. We need access to some of this equipment, the servers and routers and switches and all that. Are you going to help us with 5G? Are you going to help us develop this industry? Or are you just going to sanction us, right? And it's the same as the Brazilians say, okay, are you going to do anything to help us protect the Amazon? Or are you just going to say, you bad people, Brazilians, you better do something about the Amazon? And they say, well, you cut all your trees down. How come now we don't get to do it? I'm just giving you a parallel example, but I think that's where things become complicated.
Another question. Thank you for your very informative presentation and making such compelling case that economic statecraft is far from paced. And as a matter of fact, it is more relevant than ever. I'm not an economist, but I wonder what discourses, rhetoric, or forces in public life today has contributed to the misconceptions of the economic statecraft is passé. Who benefits from keeping this myth alive, and what can be done to correct this misguided popular opinion?
So I think I want to pick on both economists and political scientists here. So the political scientists who work in so-called hard security, bombs and bullets, as we used to joke around, bombs and bullets types, They don't care much about the economic aspects of economic interaction. And honestly, a lot of my economist friends, whenever I talk about this, their eyes glaze over and they say, oh, so you're one of those protectionists and you just want to, you know, not allow global trade. And I go, actually, I'm the biggest supporter of global trade compared to some of these economists. And so there's a misconception. Number one, economists like free markets, which is understandable why I like free markets. But the point is that you may like free markets, but there's still going to be intervention. And the issue here is, how do we think about the problem of intervention in markets? How do we try to regulate it? How do we develop regional arrangements to deal with it? How do we develop global arrangements to deal with that? How do we rescue the WTO from all of the excitement about intervention? So I'm, if you want, a true realist in the sense that I look at what's on the ground, not what's in the ideal political security model or the ideal economic model, which says we would be better off. We would be better off if nobody ever intervened and we had free markets and everybody had a job. I'm for that, okay? That's not the reality we live in, okay? So I like models, but you have to be very careful on how you use these models, how you think about it. And if you don't develop tools to think about real world intervention, I think you have a problem. And that's all we're trying to say, is that we need to think more carefully about how are these tools used, under what conditions, and how do we cope with them, and what are the implications, then blindly keep saying, no, no intervention, no, no intervention, or, oh no, it's all about security, it's all about security. That's all we're trying. We don't claim to be making a huge claim beyond this is going on and we should think about it.
This is the last question from Konkan University, Thailand. Following your dual technology on human capital development, form as the state interventions to influence labor market. Furthermore, what kind of state intervention for human capital skill strategies beyond Southeast Asia countries?
So I'm not quite sure what the, so is asking.
It's asking like, what kind of state intervention for human capital skill strategy beyond Southeast Asia's countries on the state intervention to influence labor market?
So if I understand the question correctly, is how do we promote human capital and human capital development? I think we see these things in the United States, in other countries, they call this active labor market policy. The United States has never liked active labor market policies. The only thing we do is actually have trade adjustment assistance. And active labor market policies means you help retrain workers who lose their jobs. And the Europeans, not all of them, but if you look at the Swedes, if you look at the Danish, the Nordic countries, they do this very well. And I often say this, my economist friends would tell me, oh, it's terrible to have intervention to help workers and intervene in this way because that's bad for the market, distorts them. I say, let's think about this for a moment. If you did not have tenure, and your job was going to be taken by some Indian or Chinese, how would you feel about free markets? Oh, well, that's different. Okay, no, it's not different. It's exactly the same thing, right? And the most honest economists should give up tenure if they're going to tell everybody else to adjust. Okay, so what does active labor market policy mean? It means training, worker training, making sure people have pensions, getting them a good education, vocational schools. In Korea, and I will just use that as an example, the Koreans started freaking out for the opposite problem of the United States. There were too many people going to four-year universities in Korea, and the number of university positions exceeded the number of high school graduates. And to pick on myself, they were all studying political science and other subjects in which they couldn't get a job. And meanwhile, there were not enough workers to work in the Hyundai plant and paying $100,000 a year starting, but everybody wanted to be a social scientist or this scientist or that. And I'm not going to pick on everybody's field, including mine, but there is a bias. In Britain, it was about everybody should study, philosophy or whatever. And I'm not saying we should study these. I like philosophy, but there hasn't been a reconciliation of the demands of the labor market and what people are studying. And all you have to do is go on to websites of companies, and you will see literally at the companies Google and Apple and Facebook, hundreds, if not thousands of jobs, despite layoffs, looking for certain software engineers and content managers and content development and so on. So we have not done a very good job of directing that. So in terms of human capital development, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's very important to have an educational system where people learn about these things. They don't all have to learn to be programmers, but they should learn about data. And at Berkeley, we have a data department. We're trying to get data infused in all of the departments so people learn to work with data, are not scared about data. And data, as people say, is the new oil, right? That's how the economy works, on data and information. So I don't want to say this in front of Teng Bui, but he's the expert on information management, and all this is what his field is. And so he knows all about the importance of data, preaching to the converted or to the leaders. So that's very important. And I think students need to be educated in these areas, right? We can't just say, well, and actually in some of our departments in political science, we all have this data center and data institutes and data use techniques. And so we don't have to be scared of data. And that's why we become social scientists or whatever, because we don't want to do math. I don't think it's not all math, a lot of this. And I think a lot of things are becoming interesting, like ChatGPT. Everybody's talking about AI now, right? For maybe the wrong reason, but everybody's talking about AI. And suddenly people say, what kind of algorithm are they using? So this lingo is proliferating among students. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a bad thing if they cheat, but it's a good thing that they sort of understand, wow, this is really important, that, you know, this technology is affecting our daily lives, and not just where did I post.
Can I follow up on that? I think you called it labor development, right? So I understand the ivory towers, that's an interesting conversation, but what about all these people who've lost their coal mining jobs in Appalachia? They're very expensive to us for a bunch of reasons, including addiction and healthcare needs. Wouldn't it make more sense to economists to do labor training and labor development for people who are losing jobs as we're shifting industries, or do economists think that's a waste?
Well, I don't think all economists do, but there's a skepticism of active labor market policy among, say, Chicago school economists, right? And so they see any intervention will prevent people from naturally moving. And my favorite semi-joke is, I always tell my economist friends, I said, I agree that steel workers should become nurses, which is, you know, a very high in demand industry where the salaries are very high starting. However, why don't you stand in front of me when we go tell the steelworker, generally a male steelworker, that we've decided you should become a nurse. And when they take a swing at you, I'll duck, right? And so the point is, getting people in industries like coal and steel, I think it's a lost cause. Honestly, I think these people should be helped with pensions and other support, but we should discourage people from going massively into coal and steel by simply protecting these industries. And that's where I differ with Trump, whose coalition was, let's help Trump, let's help steel, and let's help coal, because my coalition is, you know, here and here and here, and that's where we're going to work. I mean, go look at the Tesla plant in Fremont. There are very few workers. In fact, there are people on a computer typing while the robots do the assembly of the cars. We're in a new world. It's about data, it's about robotics, and all of these.
But maybe the fundamental premise that people will move is just wrong. I mean, people who live in the Appalachians have been there for 150 years. They're not moving. They're obviously not moving. They might die of opioid overdose, but they're not moving. And given that they don't move, that premise is faulty of economists, right?
Well, that's
so labor development's really important to retrain
well,
them.
that's why I think, well, one thing is that younger people will leave, right? Older people will not leave. Younger people may not leave.
As an anthropologist, I'd say no, probably a lot of them won't actually.
Yeah. So what's the solution then? Well,
for the government to put in some sorts of training so that they can work locally.
Yeah,
but
and
not mining.
So it is possible for them to switch industries. And I think of the best example is Pittsburgh. Yeah. Pittsburgh, which is the classic steel town. That's all they did in Pittsburgh, right? Steel, 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 not cars, steel, steel, steel. Pittsburgh is a very dynamic city today. It's medical, it has a huge medical operations around there. They're getting into IT, other kinds of manufacturing. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have manufacturing jobs, but it doesn't mean you have to do steel manufacturing. And at the end of the day, with advanced technology and robotics, these jobs are going to go away anyways, whether or not foreigners are selling you the stuff or other domestic companies. So the reality is that's going to happen. But the way I believe it is to cushion it. Why? Because it's better than these people seeking protection, which undermines the economy by just protecting these jobs, but in fact, they're not viable jobs. So the answer is active labor market policy to prevent protectionism. And I always tell my economist friends, which country in Europe is the most free trade? The answer is, believe it or not, Sweden. Because if you lose your job in Sweden, you still have a pension and you still have healthcare and you probably still have a place to live. Whereas if you lose your job in the United States and you're not highly educated and become a software worker, your life is basically screwed. Use a technical term, right? So, I mean, you're in big trouble. So I think that is a problem. And I think as an anthropologist, I think you have a lot to say to that problem.
I think it was interesting that started with it's the economy stupid, because that was Bill Clinton's kind of economic campaign to help people that had been displaced in the recession. But then Clinton was also the one that really pushed forward things like NAFTA. He elevated APEC, right? Was real like Democrat, but he was one of the centrist Democrats that really pushed forward free trade. And it sort of makes me also think, you know, you talked about how, you know, the 30s was a lot of protectionism and a lot of conflict followed, but also like, you know, pre-World War I, right? Or even like in this era, there's a lot of people that say, well, it's sort of this era of sort of free trade and globalization that's displaced a lot of people, that's led to this rise in populism and these kinds of things as well. So it just had me thinking about, you know, we were seeing, you're talking about the spatial variation among different places, but we're also seeing a kind of temporal like variation and sort of a change over time, where now it's really, you know, the whole notion of globalization and sort of free trade is really coming under a lot of questioning.
Yeah. Well, I think that the answer partly lies in that we had an embedded, this is to use John Ruggie's term, an embedded liberal compromise in the United States that yes, you're going to lose your job, but there will be adjustment assistance, there will be other ways to help you. So there would be adjustment of the economy. So the notion that, well, there'll just be smooth adjustment, there won't be a problem, was misleading, because in fact, what people did is seek protection. And I can think of all the industries that did that. Textiles, #1, and apparel seeking protection, steel industry seeking protection, auto seeking protection, semiconductor seeking protection, even in the 80s, consumer electronics, television industry seeking protection. I can go on and on. Motorcycle seeking protection. So the point is, if you don't want people to seek inefficient protection, which most of this is, we have to give them an alternative, then say, go become a nurse and a software engineer, because that's the high-paying jobs, and expect they're going to pick up and go leave and do that. And I think that's why globalization has been criticized, and I think rightly so by some people, which we did not take into account the social factors. And if we just moved laborers as a cost of production, moving on A to B and so on, without thinking about the transaction costs, we didn't think, and that's why transaction cost economists are different. They don't have this view, right? A lot of them believe in high transaction cost issues, like Oliver Williamson who passed, but my colleague at Berkeley talked a lot about transaction costs and, you know, cost of adjustment and so on. And if we don't pay enough attention to that, I think we will have more problems with globalization, which will undermine the whole global economy, which at the end of the day is not something anybody really wants.
Well, it's 4:25, so we've gone a little bit over, but I think it's been a really engaging conversation. It's one we can continue upstairs. But in the meantime, please help me thank Vinod Aggarwal for an awesome presentation.
There is wine at the reception station.